Los Angeles, 1947. The city, filled with the hum of cars, the noise of the streets, and the light of eternal day, hides dark corners unseen by ordinary people. One day, in a quiet neighborhood of Hollywood, 27-year-old actress Elizabeth Gray vanishes. She was at the peak of her career, popular and ambitious, but suddenly disappears without a trace, leaving her belongings in her apartment and an endlessly empty street behind her. No body is found, and the investigation stalls. The police search, but no clues lead to an answer. A week later, another woman disappears, this time a former model, also connected to the high circles of Hollywood. Local newspapers soon begin to fill with headlines about a mysterious killer lurking in Los Angeles, one who leaves behind a trail of missing people with no traces. However, what no one knows is that the killer is not just a person, but a dark, ominous entity that has begun to hunt those who cross its path. A few weeks after Elizabeth's disappearance, Los Angeles is engulfed by a strange, thick fog that fills the streets like a living creature. This was no ordinary fog, it felt like a mass of evil. Not everyone noticed it, but those who knew what was happening in the mist said it trapped people in its embrace, like a snare. Jonathan Miller, an experienced detective who took on the case of the disappearances, soon realized the fog was an inexplicable phenomenon. One night, as he tried to trace Elizabeth's whereabouts on one of the empty streets, he saw a strange figure in the mist. The figure moved smoothly, as if an invisible force was guiding it, and each step created sounds that echoed into the void. His pulse quickened as the fog thickened, and the figure became not just a ghost, but death itself, something he could not explain. Jonathan understood that the investigation had gone beyond mere murders, and he was now dealing with something much more sinister, a ghostly killer that operated in the darkest corners of the city. At night, as Jonathan continued his investigation, he encountered a woman who claimed to have seen the one responsible for the disappearance of her sister, another actress who vanished several years ago. According to her, it was a man with eyes empty and black, like the abyss itself, and his presence left not fog behind him, but a shadow. She spoke of strange encounters with him and how his shadow would move along the walls, as if the city itself were a living entity. Jonathan listened intently to the woman's story and promised her he would find this person. He was certain that what she described was no ordinary crime. It was something far darker and more terrifying. Meanwhile, the shadow of the killer became ever more tangible, and with every step Jonathan took, he got closer to uncovering the dreadful truth. Unable to shake off the mystic fear that was consuming him, Jonathan began to dig deeper into the city's history. He stumbled upon an old legend that had been forgotten by the residents of Los Angeles. The legend told of a man from the late 19th century who killed his victims with such brutality that, after his death, his soul remained trapped within the city. His body was found, but his spirit could not leave, and it began to haunt those who became part of his world. This was the ghost of the killer, a sinister entity that sought new victims to reclaim control over reality. He appeared in the fog, in the darkest corners of the city, stalking those brave enough to seek answers. Jonathan was stunned by the history his investigation had uncovered. He realized that everything that had been happening was connected to this ancient force. But he didn't know how to stop it, especially when it was so powerful that it could transcend time and space. When Jonathan, filled with new knowledge, returned to Los Angeles, he found that the fog was growing thicker, and the missing women were not the only victims. Men, children, and the elderly began to disappear into this ominous cloud, as if the city itself were devouring them, losing them in an endless cycle. Each person who vanished left behind a strange mark, a frozen stare, empty eyes that could no longer see the light. Jonathan knew now that the killer was not just a person. He was part of something much more terrifying and powerful. He was a living curse, an invisible force that fed on fear, taking those who dared uncover his secrets into his shadows. That night, Jonathan did everything he could to stop the terror. He came to the place where an old railroad track had once been, where, according to rumors, the killer had come from. There, he found signs, not just human, but marks of the shadow. Jonathan realized that if he didn't stop this now, he too would become part of this abyss. Inside the dark tunnel, he heard footsteps. Suddenly, from the fog, a figure appeared, and Jonathan, determined to fight, knew that only one death could break this vicious cycle. When Jonathan stepped into the tunnel, a figure emerged from the fog. His heart raced as he recognized it. It was not just a person, but the ghost of the killer, the very entity he had been searching for. The figure stood before him, its body obscured by darkness, and its face unseen. Jonathan could feel an unimaginable cold wrap around his body, as though all life had left him. From the fog came a voice, soft and raspy, like the resurrection of the dead. "Do you think you can defeat me?" Jonathan took a step forward, hoping his resolve would carry him. He drew his gun and aimed it at the figure, but at that moment, it vanished into the air, and the gun felt like an empty trick. The fog closed in around him, tightening with every breath. He realized he was caught in a trap that could devour his soul as it consumed bodies. Unable to move, Jonathan felt his thoughts start to blur. He was trapped in this cursed place, which seemed to have no beginning or end. The ghost of the killer vanished, and Jonathan found himself alone, trapped in a world without time or space. He realized that nothing existed here except fear itself, and the emptiness in which his mind began to dissolve. That night, he once again heard footsteps. First faint, then growing louder, until they merged into a constant, maddening sound that ripped through the space around him. These were not the footsteps of a human. They were the steps of some sinister creature, moving toward him, as if ready to claim his soul. Suddenly, Jonathan felt an unimaginable cold envelop his body. In the darkness, he saw eyes, empty, dark eyes, like the abyss itself. Eyes that were watching him, seemingly getting closer, closing in on his mind, devouring his last thoughts. "You were chosen," a whisper echoed in his head. In that moment, Jonathan understood that he had become part of the void. He had lost not only his body, but his very identity. He was now one of those who would forever vanish into this world, a shadow among shadows. Jonathan was still trapped, but he was not alone. He began to encounter others, people who had disappeared before him. They were all here, but could not leave this world. Their faces were twisted with horror, and their eyes were hollow, like those who could never return. In their hearts remained only fear and confusion. One of them, an old man named Frank, approached Jonathan and quietly said, "You're not the first, and you won't be the last. We were all killed by this monster, this killer. But he doesn't just kill. He takes us to make us part of his curse. We're here because no one can leave this world until he takes everything." Frank told Jonathan about how the ghost of the killer had come to Los Angeles many years ago, claiming more and more people into its shadow. This was not just a spirit, but something much older and more malevolent. It was like poison, seeping into people's hearts, leading them into the void, where they became part of its shadow. "If you want to escape, you must destroy his power," Frank said, gesturing at the darkness around them. "But for that, you need to find his source. Find his soul." But how could one find his soul when the very void was his realm? Despite all the fear and confusion, Jonathan couldn't accept that his life was in the hands of this creature. He decided he must find a way to break free, destroy the curse, and stop the killer. He knew he had to understand what bound the killer to this world. He returned to the places where the investigation had recently taken place, studying old documents that had not yet disappeared. He found notes about strange events occurring in Los Angeles as far back as the late 19th century. They spoke of ancient rituals and magic used to control souls. As Jonathan delved deeper into these texts, he realized that the killer was not just a man, but part of a dark force that had existed in Los Angeles since the city's founding. He was the embodiment of that very force, feeding on human fear and seeking to control the city. He understood that to defeat the killer, he had to destroy his connection to this world, to obliterate the source of his power. But the path to that was darkness and doom. Jonathan realized that the only way to stop the killer was to find his source, the place from which his power originated. That place was hidden in the darkest corners of the city, in a place where no ordinary person could survive. That night, he returned to where no one dared to go. It was an abandoned building, once known as a center for occult practices in the heart of Los Angeles. Here, according to rumors, the rituals that awakened this dark force had been performed. As soon as Jonathan entered the building, he felt his body begin to constrict, the air becoming heavy and thick. He was not alone. The ghost of the killer stood before him, like a shadow with no form, but possessing unimaginable power. "You're too late," the voice said. But Jonathan didn't retreat. He knew that only he could break the cycle of fear and tyranny. The battle ahead was not just for his life, but for the freedom of all those who had become part of this shadow. As the ghost raised its hands, ready to consume him, Jonathan took one last step. He pulled out an amulet he had found in the archives and uttered ancient words, severing the killer's connection to this world. The building trembled as if the very space around it was tearing apart. The shadow vanished, and with it, the fear. But the question remained, had Jonathan truly been freed, or had he become part of the void forever? Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and watch my other videos.